Okay. Um, I've known David for a while here, just and especially when he started offering botany rambles in Ben Allen and around Indian Falls, and learn so we could learn all the different goldenrods that we have, and and he knows his geology too. He knows all the different colors of clay that are visible at Indian Falls, and so it's been a real treat to get a chance to know nature better through his research that he shares. That he teaches himself, and then he teaches us, and it's been terrific to do that with him. He's also done a lot of volunteering and presented some other things with Members Night from time to time. So that's always been another learning experience with David um, along the way. And also reading his biography material that he sent to me, he's also very active in the community, helping community groups and welcoming new people here. I remember he was checking with me for extra brochures for the season for newcomers to the city and to the neighborhood. And so I'm really pleased that we have somebody that's that active with the community in that type of program. The David is also uh, has a master's degree in science in crop science, sorry, from University of Guelph. And one of the things I learned in his activities in the past was that he was active in doing presentations at farmers' weeks, like the one that we have at Elmwood with the Grey Bruce Farmers Week. That there used to be farmers' weeks in Simcoe County and Peel County and at Ridgetown and maybe some other places. But David would do presentations at those for one day or a half a day, a program like that. And I checked with Lori Smith, who's just retired from Gray Ag Services in Markdale. And this one at Elmwood is the only one that's still running. And I think it's running because the Gray Ag Services people took it on right away as soon as they formed to get that established and maintain it. And they also pivoted on doing this, providing some online presentations of those programs a few years ago, even before Zoom, before we had the pandemic. So they've really, I think we're really fortunate that we still have that Grey Bruce Farmers Week here because nobody else has one in the area at all. And so I'm really looking forward to David's talk. I'm just going to invite him to come up and give it a start.
Well, thank you, John, for your words of introduction. We'll just get our microphone adjusted here a bit so you can hear me better. I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for those who are joining us by Zoom. I want to thank the field naturalists for giving me this opportunity to talk dirty in public for once. So what inspired me to do this talk tonight? Part of my academic and professional background. I learned a lot about soils over the years, at least I think I did. But it was more recently inspired by having heard an excellent presentation by Bob Gray a few years ago, where he talked about the geology and the landforms of this area. Get rid of my hat up here now. And their effect on creating all the unique habitats that we have within the area, which gives us our unique diversity of plants and animals that live here. But the agriculturist to me and said, okay, that's great, but we need to take it one step further to complete the picture, and that is to talk about the soils that developed on all those landforms, because it's the soil on which things grow and upon which all those plants and animals and us depend upon. So that was my motivation for this talk tonight. So Brian, if we get rid of the lights, we'll get going here. So a quick overview of what I want to talk about. Very briefly, just remind ourselves of the importance of soils. A quick look at the kind of diversity that we do have in the area. And we'll talk about that in more length later on in the presentation. An explanation of some terms used in soil science, because like every other science, it has its jargon, of which I will use some. We'll talk about the processes that resulted in the formation of the soils that we have. Some common, we'll look at some of the more common types of soil in the area and where they're located. And finalize with a discussion about soil health and its dark side, soil degradation. So again, just I think we all understand why soils are important, but here's a quote that says it's a quote of soft material held to the earth by gravity is all that lies between life and lifelessness. And that's generally true. We all depend on what grows in our soils for much of our food and some of our beverages, some of the things that we wear. Soils are being increasingly looked at as a place for carbon sequestration, try and help with the climate change issue. It turns out that grasslands are particularly good at holding on to carbon. And there's also a lot of work going on right now for converting plant materials into fuels and also bioplastics that are biodegradable as a means to reducing our fossil fuel consumption. In preparing these talks, I drew quite heavily on these two reports, the Soil Survey of Grey County and Soil Survey of Bruce County. These are both available online from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. You could just Google the name of the soil map and you can find the copy of the book in PDF form. There's also a copy of the JPEG of the maps there that you can download or look at online. I have to take my hat off. I've already done that, I guess, but admire the people that did these reports. These reports were published in the early 1950s. Some of the terminology might have changed, but the basic information is still valid. And they're the result of work that was done in these areas over the course of 3 summers in the late 40s, early 50s, where a crew of men, I assume, in those era, went across these counties and took soil samples, probably thousands of them, to characterize the soils in this area. Keeping in mind, when we think about what kind of a work that was, it was all done by hand. That was before computers and mini diggers and all those kinds of things. And they literally took thousands of samples because each county has about 1 million acres of land in it. So even if you're only sampling once in 100 acres, that's still a lot of samples. And involved digging a hole to look at what was underneath the soil surface. This is kind of what they were looking for. This is called a soil profile. It's a bit fuzzy in this image because it's one I blew up from scanned and expanded from a book, but it's reflective of what a soil in this area might look like. So what they were looking for is this cross-section. The scientists call it a soil profile. On the left is the scale in centimeters, so this hole was about 2 feet deep. Some went as deep as 3. And on the right-hand side, we have labels on the various layers that these men or people were able to see in the soil. At the very bottom, you see a C, which represents what was called the parent material, which is essentially unchanged from what the glaciers left behind however many thousand years ago. And that is what the rest of the soil has developed upon, thanks to the various forces of nature. On the very top, there's an organic layer. In this case, in this area, it would have been mostly leaf litter because our soils were generally developed under woods, trees. Below that is the A horizon, which is darker. That's our topsoil. And it's darkened because of organic matter that's moved down from the organic layer on top. So this is this is our best part of the soil. That's where our roots grow. Is the best airspace for roots and water retention, where the most nutrients are. Below that is the B horizon or subsoil, which is also darkened a bit because of the material that's moved down into it from the A horizon in forms of fine clay and some organic matter. But the difference from one soil to another, these horizons can differ in color, in what we call texture, which I'll explain in a minute, and their thickness and stoniest and things like that. And it's those kinds of difference that characterize one soil type versus another. Just a quick look at the kind of the diversity of soils that we have in this area. Oh, this is a part of the map for Bruce County, southern Bruce. What I want you to notice in this map is just how many different colors there are. And each color represents something called a soil series, which is a group of soil types, but that are very similar. But the key thing is there's a lot of different colors on there. So our soils are very diverse in this area. Grey County is equally diverse as Bruce. I would hazard a guess that this area is one of the most diverse soil range of soils of just about anywhere in the province. And that's because of our geological history we'll also make reference to here in a minute. So this is a rather lengthy definition, official definition from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as to what a soil is. We put it simply, it's just the loose material on top of the earth that has been changed by the forces of nature in some way. So it's different than what was laid down by the glaciers. So that's our definition of soil. The key aspect is the change. Ideally, in a soil, we'd like to have roughly half of the space occupied by solid material, mostly ground up rock with some organic matter. The other half of the volume would be pore space, which is half filled with air, half filled with water. It's kind of an idealized situation that we will want to drive for. The organic matter, roughly 5% of the solid material, and that's a really crucial part of our soils, as we'll hear about later on, particularly when we're talking about soil health. Now, some terminology, I'm afraid, but it helps to understand what you'll see later on. So the first distinction I want to make is between something called soil texture and our soil types. And I do this myself. Someone will say, what type of soil is that? And I'll say, oh, it's a sandy loam or a clay loam or something. But when we use terms like that, actually what we're talking about is the soil texture. We'll define that a little bit more in a minute, as opposed to soil type. The soil type has a name attached to it, which defines where that soil was first characterized. So we get something like a Hairston silt loam. As we look at our maps, you will see that there's a lot of local names used in it, which to me says this is the area where these soils were first described, which may mean that they're actually unique to this area, but I can't confirm that part. So soil texture just refers to the various proportions of the various sizes of soil particles. The coarsest ones being the sands, like 2 millimeters of fairly big sand that would definitely be coarse sand, and the 20th 0.05 would be very fine sand. And next time down is the silt, which is pretty fine, and then really fine is the clay. The clay is so fine that one of the characteristics of it is when it gets dissolved and suspended in water, it stays in suspension for a long time, and that's why we have the soils that are formed, or our clay soils are essentially formed in the bottom of old lakes. The sand and the silt drop out fairly quickly when a stream enters the calmer waters, but the clay just gets carried out in the midst and gradually settles out. And this is a fairly common triangle that you'll see in soil documents illustrating how the various soil particles are combined together to form our various textural groups. Each point of that triangle represents a pure one type or another: clay at the top, silt at the bottom right, sand at the bottom left. We don't often see soils that are pure clay or pure silt. Pure sand is not all that unusual because that's what our beaches are for the most part. The other point I want to make on this one is just how big that area at the top for the clay soils is compared to the area for the silts and the sands, which is reflective of how influential the clay portion is on the soil characteristics, partly because it's so fine and that packs together really tightly. If you don't believe me that it packs together tightly, think of what pottery is made out of. That's clay, pure clay, which would not be a very good medium to try and grow things in. So the sweet spot's down more towards the bottom center where we're into our loams, regardless of the types. Sands have their challenges too because they dry out so much. So a good mix is what one wants to strive for or would like to look for if you're looking for land. Okay. As I said, the fine material is packed together very tightly, but thankfully, Mother Nature has a remedy for that. It's something called soil structure, because all these little particles stick together to form bigger groups called soil aggregates. And this is where soil or organic matter has a key part to play, because it is the glue that holds these aggregates together, especially in resistance to moisture. And we'll talk about that again when we come to soil health. So we have soil texture, soil type, and soil aggregates. And a little bit more as we work our way through like every science, it has its own hierarchy of characteristics. We're not going to say too much about the first two there. They're basically defined by what the parent material was originally and what vegetation grew on top of it. So you get a very different soil depending on whether you've got tundra or grassland or boreal forest or hardwood forest, in our case, will generate a very different type of soil. Coming down the list more locally, what's representative of all those colors on that map we saw is something called soil series, which are groups of soils that are alike in all respects except the soil texture on top. So, and these are the ones that have a local place name, like Hairston or Kemble or Wyerton. We'll see a number of these, and we'll get later on. So we got 34 different soil series in gray and 37 in Bruce. Just again, highlighting how diverse our soils are. And each of those soil types is made up of upwards of 1 to 3 soil types. So a soil type is defined as soils in a soil series that are like in all major characteristics, including the texture. And then in the end, we get the place name attached to that. And one finer distinction, we go down to something called soil phase within a soil type, differentiated by something like a change in topography or stoniness. In the official definition, these are referred to as minor characteristics. But I would suspect that whoever decided that stoniness was a minor characteristic probably didn't grow up in Keppel. So what influences the soil that in the way it forms and whatever setting it's in is, I've kind of touched on all these already. I think for the most part, our parent material is crucial, whether it was clay or sand or silt or something in between. How well it's drained, because its formation is important for having water moving through it, but you don't want water sitting in it for any length of time. The natural vegetation I mentioned too. Climate, again, relates to how long the water moves down through it in the course of a season. So a drier climate in a shorter season, your soils tend to develop more slowly. Topography has an effect in terms of, again, water flow and runoff and erosion, and the age of the soil is a factor. In global terms, our soils here are relatively young, because it's only been a few thousand years that since the glaciers retreated and the glacial lakes were drained, whereas you get into the tropics, some of those areas were never glaciated, so those soils are really, really old and well leached out. So having a young soil is beneficial because we've still got all the good stuff in it that hasn't been leached away yet. So I've talked a lot about the parent materials. So within this area, what types of materials did the glaciers leave it? The biggest part of our counties are what's called limestone till. In this case, we'd probably call it dull stone till if we were doing this now. And this is the materials that were carried within the ice or pushed along under the ice. Because I think you've heard enough talk about glaciation to know that, oops, that must have hit the wrong, well, I'll get back to where I want to be here in a minute. Figure out these buttons. Okay, back to this one. Sorry about that. So as the glaciers flowed, they picked up whatever was underneath them as they moved along, which was material left by the previous ice glacial period, and dragged it along with them. And as the ice melted back, it dropped out whatever was within it. And so we have large areas, or what are known as limestone or till plains. The other till area are moraines, which we'll talk a bit about more in a minute when we look at the next graphic. We have lacustrine materials that roll lake bottoms. We have poorly sorted sands and gravels, which are materials that were basically deposited under the ice by rapidly flowing water. There were rivers flowing under some of our glaciers that sorted out the material as it flowed along, left the gravel, the coarser materials underneath the ice, and took the fine stuff to the shore, which gives us our well-sorted sands and gravels. There's something in this area that they call shallow drift over limestone bedrock. The shallow over limestone kind of tells you what we're talking about here. It's much of the Bruce Peninsula, top of the escarpment, very shallow soils over rock. And particularly in Bruce County, there's a lot of that in terms of proportion of the area. We have alluvial materials or floodplains where the material is being dropped off by rivers or out of the rivers even now as they flood in the spring. And our organic materials in our wetlands, which were of not particular big interest to the men doing these maps for the soil reports because of an agricultural focus. But our wetlands are very important for the diversity of habitats for wildlife and wild flora in this area that gives our unique characteristics. So what fertile landforms got left behind after our glaciers retreated? This is a map I lifted off the internet somewhere. It's extracted from a larger map. My apologies for those of you that are zooming in from Tobermory for having chopped you off here. But it's up in that area, if you could look between Owen Sound and Culpoise Bay, you kind of see a dark color. That's representative of that shallow soil over bedrock. Along the edge of Owen Sound, you can see a lighter area, and between the dark area and the light area, there's some hash marks. That represents the edge of the Niagara Escarpment. The hash marks right along the shore represent old shorelines of Lake Algonquin, Lake Nipissing. Along the shore of Lake Huron, over on the side, we have a sandy colored area, which not surprisingly represents sand. But much of the county is with a lighter pink colored, which represents our limestone till plains, which comprise a big portion of Grey and Bruce. And all the little marks on there that look like a fleet of boats on those areas, those represent drumlins, which are mounds left behind the glaciers. The darker purpley colored bands running diagonally across are representative of various moraines that were formed during the time that the ice was retreating in general. But the ice did not go back uniformly. It would advance and hit a point where it was melting off the front as fast as it would be forming on the back. But the ice underneath kept flowing, so it kept pushing stuff along and dropping it at the leading edge. And then it would retreat more for a while. And then the climate would change and the ice would, overall front edge would start to advance again. So you got another line. And this has obviously happened a number of times over the general period when our ice sheet was retreating. So that's pushed up fairly high ridges in various parts across Grey and Bruce. Over to the bottom left, we see some blue color, which represents an old lake bottom. And down at the bottom is green colored, which is reflective of one of those deposits where the ice or the gravel was being dropped underneath the ice. So I think I'll just move along from that because we've already pretty much talked about that. So here's a close-up of what one can see on a soil map. This is just a screenshot of one of the maps that I was talking about being available online. This is the area around Holland Center. My reason for picking that one was highly personal because my mother grew up on a farm down towards the bottom left-hand corner of this map some 100 years ago. I grew up in the Niagara Peninsula because Mom went down there to teach school and met Dad, and here I am. The rest is history. So I grew up in the Niagara area. Again, on this map, there's quite a bit of information. You can see the contour lines, so showing off our landforms. There's varying colors representing the various soil series. And on each of those, there's a letter code. Up on the upper left, you'll see a OL, which stands for Osprey loam, which is a fine text described as a medium textured till, well drained. It's moderate to steeply sloping. I suspect that the steep slopes are the drumlins. The downside of this soil is it's stony, very stony. And similar to it is one called PL1, which is Pike Lake loam. Very similar, except the only difference I could see from reading the map was it's different color. So probably formed from a different type of rock. The purpley band across there is something called Donnybrook Sandy Loam. And I thought, oh, I put that on just because I like the name, because Donnybrook, to me, conjures up images of riots and riotous stuff, which is actually fairly accurate for this because it's one of our poorly sorted sand and gravel. I suspect, without having really checked into it, that this might be the remnants of a moraine. But if you're, a lot of our gravel pits probably are found in that type of soil area because of the sand and gravel. And what else have we got in there? We've got a fair bit of gray area labeled M, which they use to call muck, but that's our wetlands. As I mentioned before, they're quite crucial to our diversity of flora and fauna. And down at the bottom left, we have BL, which are floodplains, or bottomland, as they define it. In the middle, there's a little spot labeled HAL. That's one of our local names. That's the Harkaway loam, which is a fairly medium textured, well drained, and they're named after the crossroads of Harkaway. And it's fairly makes up a fair bit of the soil in this area. It's pretty good land because it's not too stony and well drained and not too steep. I don't know how I'm doing here for time, but quick look at the rest of these maps. This is the Upper Bruce County and Bruce Peninsula. Much of it is labeled BP, which is the different way of just talking about the shallow soils over bedrock. That's called the Braypen land type. They don't even call it a soil type. They call it a land type because in much of it there is no soil or very little. But the scale of these maps is such that it's 1 inch to a mile, so that the smallest spot that shows up on the map will be 25 acres. So if anything, our maps underrepresent the diversity that's here, because even in a 25-acre field, you could have easily have more than one soil type, maybe as many as 3, so, given the general diversity. So that's much of the Bruce Peninsula, and you could follow it across the top of along the escarpment. Partway down, we have a bluey colored area, which is the Ferndale silty clay loam. old lake bottom, probably deposited there from Lake Algonquin, Lake Nipissing, as I understand it. But it's described as poorly drained. I think basically because it's an old depression where there wasn't much space for the water to drain off. But now it's been drained and it's a very productive agriculture area, as you'll see if you drive up Highway 6 in the summertime. On the left-hand side, there's two different sands. The reason I put them in there was because one of them is very well drained, actually described as excessively drained, which is probably more what we think of with sand. We think of sand being pretty dry. That this is the Plainfield sand, which, as I interpret it, are our dunes along the Lake Huron shore. For those of you familiar, you know what we're talking about. Fairly high ridges of pretty much pure sand, dry out very quickly, very harsh environment. But right beside it, we have something called the Granby sand, which is poorly drained. And we don't think of sands as being poorly drained, at least I don't usually, but this one is. Partly, I think, because of its proximity to the lake. The water table, I know this from firsthand experience, having a cottage in that area and trying to dig post holes. Even in the midst of the summer, the water table isn't much more than a foot below the soil surface. In the spring, it's above the soil surface. So partly, I think, because of the lake level, not much difference between that, the soil level and the land. And I'm sure there's also water flowing through that area above the rock, much as happens at the Fen further south. But in this case, there's just a bit more soil material on top of it, so there's room for something, different kind of stuff to grow. Down at the bottom, we have some more of the Harkaway series and the loam in this case. So Southern Bruce, a big part of it is something called Elderslie silty clay. It's this is labeled as lacustrine, as old lake bottom. It's actually well drained, not too stony. It's probably challenging to farm it a bit because of the texture, but it's otherwise, I think, pretty good ground. Just to the right of that, there's something called Saugeen silty clay, which is heavier textured and perfectly drained. More difficult for the moisture to move through. Over to the left, we have BES, which is Berrien sand. In this case, it's an imperfectly drained, but it's well sorted, so it was an old beach at some time. It's imperfectly drained because it's got a layer of clay under the sand, which impedes both the moisture going down in the spring and back up again in the summertime. So it creates its problems. And then what else have we got? We've got Bruxton clay, which is probably the heaviest soil in this area, perfectly drained largely because of its texture. And we've got our old friend Donnybrook there as well. So some of the others I'm going to skip here just in the interest of time. This is the north part of Grey County. I won't repeat the ones we've already talked about, but up you can see upper left there, kind of in the area of Cobble Beach, we have something called MC, which is Pomorley clay loam. It's described as a heavy textured shaly hill, and it's red. So maybe may have been formed from the top of the Queenston Formation at some time. But if you are from Cobble Beach or have ever driven into Cobble Beach when they're digging basements and have noticed what the kind of stuff they dig out of the bottom of those basements, I was up there one year and they were digging out chunks of red clay the size of concrete blocks. And so that's kind of reflective of what the soil type is. There's a similar soil over on the Tank Range. I only put that in there because I was intrigued that they're actually able to get in there and do samples on the Tank Range in the 1950s. Another fairly common one here is the VSC, which stands for Vincent Silty Clay loam. It's relatively moderately sloping, not too stony, but imperfectly drained because of the texture. But I think otherwise probably fairly decent ground. I think there's a little bit of sandy area over there by Thornbury. And and there's the Wyerton silt loam up there on Keppel Township. And finally, to just wrap up these maps with a view of southern part of Grey County. I think the only one we already haven't talked about in terms of soil type is down there bottom left in the area between Dundalk and Keldon. We have something called the Listowel silt loam, which is a till soil, medium textured. And we also have a PAL, which again, similar parent material. It's Park Hill silty loam, which is the Listowel series is imperfectly drained, and Park Hill is described as poorly drained. I think in both cases it's because of the topography. These soils are kind of an old basin, which water was there, but it really had not much place to go in terms of runoff. So these are the soils this is the area that kind of gave that area the nickname Floatin' Protein. But with tile drainage, these soils can be improved and they're actually quite productive. Just in terms of going back to the wetness, you'll see some areas in there with a label M on it, which the muck, so these areas are interspersed with organic or wetlands as well. And so I think that's the last you'll have to suffer through in terms of my exploring the soil maps. But it gives you an idea of the diversity and the ones that occupy much of the area. There's quite a bit of the Osprey loam, there's the Vincent silty clay loam, and the Harkaway Harrison series, which are very similar and pretty good land, those two. So to wrap up in a few minutes talking about soil health. So here's a quote from Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s as he was introducing a program to help deal with the Dust Bowls. The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And there's been lots of civilizations over the course of time that have proven the truth of that statement. I think there's some countries that seem determined to prove that once again. I think particularly of China. That's where I understand that much of their soils and water have been polluted because of their uncontrolled industrial development, which they built without having big care as to what they were doing to their environment. So, but anyway, there's my editorial statement. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates that on a global basis, roughly a third of our soils are already degraded in some way, so that they're not capable of producing as well as they once did. But the really concerning part is the fact that they're concerned that by 2050, that could be as high as 90% if we keep on with our current trends. So what are we meaning by soil health? It's just the ability to keep producing healthy crops for benefits of ourselves and the wildlife that live on those soils, and more or less in perpetuity. So somewhat like my talk last year about sustainability. So soil health is a big part of having a sustainable system. Nationally, I'll just quickly make reference to the fact that the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Forestry of the Canadian Senate did a lot of work over a few years ago to take hearings from all across the country. Experts came in and talked about the state of the health of their soils from coast to coast to coast, literally. And they compiled this huge report, 160 some pages, talking about the state of the soils of Canada. You can, if you really want to delve into it, it's available online. But the important part of it, I think, is the takeaway is that they came up with 25 recommendations for government action to either to help preserve the health of our soils as it is, and preferably to make it even better. So when we're talking about soil health, what are we looking for? There's various indicators, whether they're physical properties or chemical or biological. As I've alluded to before, a big important part of the physical is the soil structure. and how stable the aggregates are when they get wet, because those are what help moisture move through the soil, or plants to have some airspace to grow their roots in without getting it too compacted, which is measured by bulk density. I've noted there water infiltration is a key part of that. Its ability to hold water in drier weather, and the fact that we want to have it able to resist erosion. So the capability to measure all those things is pretty well established. Similarly, with the chemical properties, we've had soil testing for years. I just note here that the plants get 15 essential nutrients from the soil. And then measure of that, so that we can measure the content availability of most of those nutrients for the test, that part. And we also can measure the soil's ability to retain most of those available for plant. And soil acidity is part of it. The biological properties are a bit more of a challenge. There are ways to measure organic matter, or at least in a general way, how much carbon there is in the soil. They talk about something called mineralizable carbon, which stuff is a material that can be digested by soil organisms to put into plant nutrients. So soil organisms are a key part of that. We want a diversity of soil organisms, from the earthworm down to the fungi and bacteria and everything in between. That gets more tricky to measure. And on the organic matter, we would like to have a diverse of forms, whether it's living, some of which is living material or recently dead, right down to the decomposed soil humus. The soil respiration and soil enzymes are lab tests to try and get at the activity of the soil organism. Somebody a few years ago, some marketing genius came up with this kind of gimmicky idea for a home test for how to evaluate the health of your soil. It's called Soil Your Undies. And it's literally what it says. So you take a cotton underwear and bury it into the soil so only the waistband is exposed. I guess if you were wanting to do this in Sport Canada, you'd use Stanfields or something like that. I assume they're still a Canadian company. And you plant it, bury it into the ground in the spring, and then you dig it up later in the summer and see what's left. So if you're ideally, what you would want is to have something come out in the fall that doesn't look very much like underwear. As on the case on the right, if you've got something that, if your shorts come out like they did in the way they went in, and it's on the left, you've got some challenges to deal with in terms of trying to restore that by getting some activity back in there, probably by getting some fresher organic matter into the system. But anybody can do that. Just you got to make sure your shorts are cotton and not some polyester, which wouldn't break down. You could probably do it with a piece of cardboard, but the risk would be that the whole thing might disappear and you wouldn't know where you'd planted it. So what are we concerned about in terms of our soil health? Lack of organic matter is an ongoing concern. I mentioned earlier on that we would like somewhere around 5 or 6 organic matter. Many of our soils are now down to, may have started out at that level, but are now down to 3.5 or less in some cases. And we would like to get that back up, because that's really what is important for our soil structure and the general overall health of the soil. It's something for the soil organism to chew on and keep things moving along. We want the lack of biodiversity in the soil as a concern. Well, those two are kind of interactive. Both of those have a big effect on how prone to erosion our soils are, and similarly how at risk of compaction they are, particularly in this day and age as our machinery keeps getting bigger and heavier. Development is a concern. I put development in quotation marks because we seem to have the attitude that farming is what you do on land until somebody comes along with what they think is a better idea. But sooner we are don't want to lose what we've got in terms of our capability of being able to feed ourselves and many people around the rest of the world. I think the rest of them kind of speak for themselves. We don't want to get too much of a particular nutrient in it. We don't want it polluted, particularly with industrial pollutants. Salinization is not a big risk in this area because of the amount of rain we get that leach sodium down through the soil. But I do wonder about the spots where the snow from our streets and our parking lots get piled in the spring, and how much salt are we putting into that land when it melts away. And finally, what are some of the things that we can do to promote soil health? I want to assure you this is my last slide. The main thing is to try and keep it protected with something on it, preferably something growing alive with lots of fine roots in the soil surface and over winter. Because the studies have shown that most of the erosion off farmland happens in the late winter, early spring, when our spring runoffs. Another vulnerable period is in the summer with thunderstorms to get the water going. So we want to try having living cover on the ground as much as we can. If we don't have living, then we would like some residue from the previous crop there to provide some cover. So try to manage that a bit with crop rotation. Now a lot of interest in what are called cover crops that are planted after a crop is harvested and preferably provide some cover over winter. Ideally, you want that living because it's, as I mentioned before, it's the living roots that are really important to creating good soil texture. It's the material that is exuded from plant roots that forms the glue that holds our soils together. We want to work it as little as possible, contrary to what we've traditionally done, because the more we work a soil, the more it introduces air into it and accelerates the loss of organic matter, makes it more vulnerable to erosion. And we've also learned over the years, particularly on sloping land, that the working the land, particularly plowing in itself, is a cause of erosion, because when you move the soil, it tends to move down the hill. So we ended up with lack of topsoil on our hills, and it's all down in the bottom. Biodiversity, we can get a range of organic matter into it. If we've got livestock nearby, on the farm or nearby, we make good use of their livestock manures. And I think everybody knows this one, stay off it when it's wet, but that can be a challenge, particularly if we want to make use of the full growing season. And it's particularly challenging for our processing vegetables because those crops are really hard on the ground, particularly in a moist year. Because if you're wanting to package up baby peas, you've got to harvest them when they're still babies, which means you go whether the soil is wet or dry. And so you can really make a mess of things with processing vegetables. In terms of our field crops that I have worked with, the best crops for soil health are the ones that have cover all year round, like our hays and pastures. Next best would be our winter cereals that we plant in the fall, harvest in the spring or summer, like wheat or rye. Next would be cereal crops because they all have fine roots in the soil surface that are pretty good for creating soil health. Corn somewhere in the middle. Root system isn't so great, but it does leave a lot of residue that can be put back in the ground. The worst ones from my perspective are the bean crops, particularly edible beans, white beans, kidney beans, because they have a terrible root system, very poor. They don't really put anything back into the soil, very little residue. So they really leave the soil quite vulnerable. Soybeans are a bit better, but again, not much in the way of root system. So the agronomist side of me is concerned about when I hear people say, well, forget eating meat. Let's all just eat beans. But that could be really destructive to our soil health because of the poor roots of those two crops. The other thing with soybeans that they for whatever reason, they leave the soil very vulnerable to erosion. So all the more important to keep it protected. So thank you very much for your attention and patience. I hope I haven't put you to sleep. So if there's still a bit of time, I would be open to entertaining a few questions. So beginning, thank you for your attention. Okay, you got a question? Sure. I don't know, to be honest. I have understood that in terms of breaking down the rocks in the first place, that the fungi do play a role in it because they were able to, and lichens and those uh, organisms were able to get their mycelia and their roots into those and kind of crack things up and have a part in break them down. But yeah, you're right. In terms of interaction between plants and fungi, where the mycorrhiza are really crucial for some crops. So you get a synergistic relationship between the fungi and the roots, whereas the fungi get their energy from the plant roots, but mobilize some nutrients for the crop. So yeah, it's a really important component. So thanks for highlighting that. Okay, so how damaging is salt from water softeners? Um, I can't speak specifically about water softeners, but I have read that there's concern about the amount of salt in general that we put into our waters, whether it's that way or by road salt. Um, People are concerned that maybe we might be turning Lake Ontario into a salt lake if we keep this up. But specifically, I don't know. But behind you maybe had the comment on that as, oh, yeah, maybe okay, sorry. All right. Who's next? I see a hand way at the back. Um, what about the soil profiles of wetland? Um, there, I I don't honestly know. My guess would be that it's basically organic material, peat and mucks on top of the whatever the original parent material was. In some cases, on top of the bedrock. But people doing the soil surveys really didn't get in there. But I think that's kind of the definition of an organic soil. It's at least 10% organic matter, and pretty much all the way down, as I understand it. What the question is, what about the other minerals that are in water? Um, there's certainly in our area, there's calcium and magnesium in our waters, which from a health point of view, probably desirable to have them in the water. I know they created a nuisance with lime in your tea kettle or crushed in your laundry, but from a health point of view, it's probably beneficial to have them there. But that's speculation. I heard a speaker one time say, somebody asked him a question and he said, well, I've already told you more than I know. So anyways, I'm kind of getting outside my range of expertise here, way over there. Okay, well, I'll start with marl first, because it's the easier one for me to kind of wrap my head around. Marl for the large part, is deposits of calcium carbonate in the bottom of a lake. Because our soils are high in calcium, so the water runs into these shallow lakes in the summertime. Water evaporates off, and the calcium carbonate precipitates out. So if this went on for several thousand years or millions of years, that would eventually become limestone. And marls are not unusual in many of our shallower lakes. We don't have a lot of farmland that's marl based. There's a big area of marl soils over in Simcoe County around Minising, which creates its own challenge because of the high calcium levels in it. Difference between drumlins and moraines. I'm kind of weak on my understanding of how drumlins are formed, but my understanding is they are reconfiguration of materials that may have been there before as the glaciers went around them, whereas the moraines are at the leading edge of the ice sheet. Does that help? And I should have made that point before, is that we talk about the ice having retreated 12,000 years ago or over the kind of peaks in 20,000 years. that was only the most recent glacial period that we've had. My understanding is that over the last million years or so, this area has been glaciated many times. And so that each new glaciation reworks, reconstructs, reconfigures whatever was left from the previous one. And so what we've got now is just the latest reconfiguration of what's here, or what was scraped off and moved around. So that's kind of what I think I've learned from having worked on the forthcoming geology and landform book. So how are we doing, Beth Ann? Okay, over here.
It burned all the supposed topsoil, so when we go up there and see flat limestone, nothing on it, not how it used to.
Okay. So the comment was that this understanding was that when the trees were cut off the Bruce Peninsula, and there were fires on the Bruce Peninsula subsequent to that, I think, Bill, and that's what would have taken off whatever was there. I could see it taking out the leaf litter and the branches and stuff, but it maybe made it more vulnerable to sand being eroded off. But specifically as to what was there, whether tree, whether there were areas that didn't even support pine trees, I don't know. With
70+ years later, would there be any noticeable change?
the big change would be that the profile would look different because they've been plowed up. The A horizons would be looking, the upper layers would maybe look different, particularly over time. Our depth of plowing has increased as our machinery got bigger. And so they've mixed some of the subsoil in with the topsoil so that if you looked at a soil map, rather than saying AH, like the one I saw, which was kind of H standing for humus, we now say AP, which means it's been plowed. And we probably would find less organic matter in that, and maybe lighter color because of having been plowed. Okay. All right. Thank you for your attention.
On behalf of everyone, David, we would like to thank you for taking us on a trip down memory lane. I'm sure, like myself, many of you found yourself in first year chemistry and maybe geology and some biology. It was excellent. Thank you for the depth and the detail of your presentation. And I have to say, as a girl who grew up farming on clay loam in Elderslie, that was kind of it.
You could kind of relate.
Yes, we had to treat that soil very carefully. It easily compacted. There was a big rush in the spring always to get on the land and get it opened up and get it dried out. But we learned that you couldn't farm that clay too soon or you would have complete rock, right?
Yep.
So now I've moved to Sarawak Township, which is marly clay. So for anybody who tries to garden on that marly clay, it's another effort in patience. So it's nice to have the verbiage to describe some of the stuff that I dig up, because sometimes I swear. Now I'm just going to say, that darn marly clay.
If you can dig it at all.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you, David, on behalf of everyone.